Hello, everyone, and welcome to another special edition of the Zero Trust Journey podcast. My name is Steve Turner. I'm one of your hosts. Today we have a really special guest. You may recognize him from one of our previous episodes. We've got Clay Taylor from Microsoft. Clay, welcome back to the show. We're so thrilled to have you back on.
Thanks, Steve. It's always good to see you, and definitely glad to be here to talk to you about Zero Trust for devices today.
We've got Clay Taylor here, who's going to talk about the devices section of the Zero Trust workshop, dive into all of the nuances that it has to do with, laying out your journey as you kind of pursue Zero Trust and kind of in the devices realm. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to you, Clay.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, definitely looking forward to diving right in. You may remember the last time we spoke, we did a deep dive on how Microsoft views Zero Trust and the overall Zero Trust journey that we've been through at Microsoft and that we're trying to help our customers through with the Zero Trust workshop. So today, we're going to basically be focused on the devices section of the Zero Trust workshop, but I want to start by just giving you a very brief recap of what we talked about last time regarding Microsoft's view of Zero Trust all up. So the first question I get asked is, why Zero Trust? And Zero Trust has definitely seen its evolution over the past few years, where it went from a exciting new thing that everyone was talking about to becoming a buzzword. And now to me, it's kind of completed its evolution. Now it's become an industry accepted term to describe end-to-end security. And it's being used by Forrester, NIST, the Department of Defense, the Open Group. Doesn't matter. Everyone is using Zero Trust to describe their end-to-end security strategy. At Microsoft, we've broken down the many ideas and principles of Zero Trust that you'll see from other vendors down to what we consider the three most important principles. These are verify explicitly, constantly validating the trust of the users, the devices, the applications, and more using data and telemetry. Using least privilege access. This is the one that's been around the longest. I've been talking about using least privilege access now for 18, 19 years. It's not going away. To me, this is one of the hardest of the three principles to actually implement because it has the most impact on your end users. Finally, assume compromise. You may have heard this called assume breach in the past, but it's basically limiting your blast radius and just assuming that an attacker at some point is going to get access, either full or partial, to one of your user accounts, a device, your domain controllers, etc. And it's basically trying to prevent lateral movement and making sure that you're not allowing that attacker to pivot to different resources in your environment. The last one here, which was kind of grayed out, it's not an official Microsoft principle, but securely enable the business. This is something that I just really like to talk about with customers because it's so important to make sure that you're not turning security knobs, just coming in and turning them on as hard as you can, because it's going to impact the business. In the same token, your business needs to be telling the security team and your IT team, what are the most important assets that I really need to protect? What are the things that I really need to focus on and not, waste my time protecting things that really aren't that important in the grand scheme of things? The other thing I just want to hit on very quickly that we talked a little bit about last time is, why should I trust you, Clay? Why should I trust Microsoft? Why should I trust anything if it's called Zero Trust? And the response to that, it's really more about zero assumed trust. It's really about, taking away these false assumptions in the left-hand column and replacing them with these zero trust mitigations. At Microsoft, we've been working very closely with NIST over the past few years, where we, have been trying to help them develop and deploy their zero trust story. And in doing that, one of the exercises we did was actually map all of our products to NIST Zero Trust Capability Mapping Diagram. This looks overwhelming, but to me, it really just shows how Microsoft has really been focused on making sure that we are giving you full coverage of your entire stack and full coverage across the entire Zero Trust story to make sure that you have the products you need to protect your assets everywhere they are. So now we're going to jump right into the Zero Trust Workshop. As a reminder, you can access this workshop today at no charge by going to aka.ms/ZT workshop. Once you get there, you're going to see there's actually two parts of the workshop. The first is an automated assessment. This is a PowerShell module that you're going to run that will allow you to actually pull data from your tenant in your environment that we don't have access to, only you have access to. And it's going to allow you to take a look at your policies overall. It's going to allow you to look at your policies, determine kind of, hey, where are you in your overall zero trust journey? As you'll see here, it gives you a very high level overview of kind of, what are the most important things in your environment that you need to focus on first. To me, this is probably the least important part of the zero trust workshop, but it's also going to give you an actual dump of all of your policies. And you're going to actually be able to come in and see, individual settings that you have set for your compliance policies, for your MAM configuration policies, for your enrollment restrictions. It's going to actually give you a list of these policies so you can actually go through and say, hey, I haven't looked at this policy in a while. Maybe there's new settings. Maybe there's something that I set 5 years ago that I, haven't gone back and revisited. And it's something that I really am seeing as a big issue when I start going through these workshops with customers is that hygiene has become a big problem. And, a lot of these policies are things that you basically set and then you forget about. And you really shouldn't. You should honestly be going back at least every 3 to 6 months and just reviewing your policies. And this tool is going to give you an opportunity to do that easily. The second part of the workshop is the manual portion. And to me, this is the most valuable piece of the workshop. You can run this on your own. If you're a partner, you can run this with your customers. But what it's going to do is actually guide you through how to actually deliver a zero trust framework in your environment and how to actually implement and deploy zero trust in your environment. You may be overwhelmed at first, but this is what it looks like. And you're going to see that, it's aligned on the zero trust pillars, not on specific products. You're going to see down here at the bottom, you have identity, devices, and data. Soon, you're going to see infrastructure, you're going to see network, and you will see apps eventually in the future.
Clay, I just want to
Yep.
interject real quick.
Yeah.
I love this part of the workshop because, to your point, the fact that you guys have designed this from a, capability standpoint, from, the areas that people need to dial into, I think is fantastic because you can use this workshop regardless if you're centered on the Microsoft platform, whether you're centered on another platform, and all the work that you guys all did with NIST and the NCCOE, piece of things, kind of demonstrated that, right? Like it showed that, whether you're all in on the Microsoft platform or you have a bunch of different other tooling, kind of at your disposal, you can make zero trust happen in your organization. So I love with the workshop, especially this piece of the workshop, folks can use this to understand where they're at and align, where the next steps they have to take are.
Great point, Steve. Yeah, and that's honestly the whole reason we built it is to give them that guidance and to give them that, kind of the on rails framework that will actually help them follow that path.
Awesome. So back to you, Clay.
Sure. Yeah. So, the other thing is that you're going to notice is that it's actually going to be breaking down, the pillars by intuitive problem areas. So, for example, on the devices section, we have an MDM for Windows section. We have MDM for iOS, for Android. We have a MAM section. We have a tenant administration section. We really try to break it down into bite-sized pieces so that you don't have to do everything at once. You can just focus on one area at a time. You're also going to see that each box actually links to guidance docs on how to do that particular step. And when you click on those links, it's going to take you to an actual GitHub docs page, which, by the way, if there are changes that you want to see made to these docs, if there are areas that you think we could improve, if there are blog posts that you think do a great job of explaining this or giving you examples of how to do these deployments, you can actually submit this yourself. We will triage it and actually add it to our docs, because this is an open source product. We really are trying to, gain insights from the community on how we can improve this always. The next part you're going to see is, and I'll show you this in the actual workshop here in just a second, but you're going to see that each one of these boxes has a drop-down menu. And in this drop-down menu, you're going to be able to select where you are on this particular piece in your Zero Trust journey. And for each of those boxes, it's going to give you the option of, not started, in planning, planned, in progress, etc. Things like third party. If you're using a third party there, that's fine. Totally okay. Just mark it as third party. If you're blocked in a particular area, mark it as blocked. And I'll show you how to take notes and actually work through those things here in just a second. And then, some of these other things are going to be marked as Microsoft roadmap, meaning this is stuff that is not quite there yet, but it's something that we're building in a lot of cases. And you'll see those actually tagged as Microsoft roadmap in the spreadsheet itself. And then finally, you'll have the option to set it as a follow-up. So if you're a partner or someone delivering this workshop to your customer, you can actually mark it as a follow-up if that customer would like more information on that, or if it's a feature that they weren't familiar with before, you can actually mark it as a follow-up and come back and do a 1 hour session just to make sure that they understand that particular box in a deep dive. Before we get into the workshop, I do just want to remind you that we definitely need your help. We'll make sure that you have these links, in the comments section, but we are really looking for your feedback. If you are running this in your own environment and you stumble somewhere, please let us know, because we want to make sure that we fix that quickly. If you have bugs, you can actually contribute or submit those bugs to the repository that we're gathering, so that we can actually go back and triage and get those items fixed quickly. The other thing, I always like to talk about is who should attend these devices workshops. And this doesn't matter if it's just you doing this on your own or if you're a partner delivering this to a customer. I really like to make sure that you have all these people in the room, because it just makes the workshop go smoother. Your MDM admin, your security admins, and your architects and security ops, your conditional access admins. This is, could be security, identity, MDM, just depends on the company. I've seen them, span all three of these areas. But I also like to have governance and risk, at least someone representing that group, because a lot of these things, as you're going through, it's nice to talk through the risk, associated with each of these boxes to determine whether or not these are things that are, high risk and stuff you need to go implement right away, or if these are things that can be, held off for a little while longer as you work on something else. I also like to say it's great to have the CISO and IT director in the room, not only to get their insights and to let them see kind of where you are on your journey, but also, as you start going through these things, if there are particular products you need, like let's say that you don't own Intune Suite or don't own IntraSuite today, as they start to see, hey, we have a lot of third-party products that are, being purchased in our environment, why can't we just replace those with something like Intune Suite or IntraSuite? I also like to go through the typical delivery breakdown. So with the devices section in particular, I will say this is probably the longest section out of all of the Zero Trust workshop so far. We are looking at a scaled down version of this that we're gonna be consolidating these, trying to get it down to a total of 2 hours at least for most companies. But we're also going to have this full workshop still available, where the Windows section, I've honestly seen it go anywhere from 1 to now like 6 or 8 hours, because I'm seeing a lot more conversation as the people implementing this and giving these workshops are getting more experience with it. I'm starting to see a lot more back and forth conversation between individuals in the room. So anywhere from 1 to, I would say actually, 4 to 6 hours is probably what I would plan on. For MAM, anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes. For iOS and Android, half an hour to an hour. And finally, for operations, about 15 minutes to 30 minutes is what I see for typical delivery breakdown. And let's jump right into the workshop. Steve, before I do that, any questions or any comments that you have, or anything that I didn't let the community know that I should have? I know that you know the space so well, so definitely looking
Yeah,
forward to your
no,
insights.
I love like the way that you talked about everything. The biggest thing that actually one question I wanted to ask you is, you talked about the governance people and the CISO being in the room. Like, what value have you seen kind of from those folks being in the room, like with these types of workshops, rather than later when these things are implemented or decisions are made?
Right. So great questions. And honestly, Steve, they bring a lot of value because there's a lot of cases where, as you're going through this, there's a lot of boxes that they're like, oh, well, I thought we had actually implemented that already, or hey, maybe this is something we actually do need to focus on. And there's a lot of cases where they're not there to correct their employees and say, hey, admin, we should have done this. Every time I've seen it, it's been an open conversation like, hey, you know, MDM admin, is this something that we should focus on first? Is this something that we should have already deployed? Is this, something that, a lot of people didn't even know that we could do? So we should, prioritize this as a new feature and go turn this on, in the next couple of weeks. And I've just seen that so often. It's just, and I would say almost every workshop I do, if those individuals are in the room, it's a much more open conversation. And it's honestly, people that they're a lot of times they're scared to bring their management, high level management into the room. But what I've seen is in every single case, it ends up being, something that helps those administrators actually either get more help to deploy these items, or actually just get buy-in that, hey, we actually probably do need these additional products or SKUs in our environment, and so let's go ahead and see what we can do about getting funding for those.
No, that's awesome. Like similar kind of assessments that I've seen done, kind of in the past. If you can get that buy-in early for folks to actually participate, to your point, I've seen it level up, resources, people, like things that folks thought that they couldn't get before, suddenly are available because, to your point, either folks realized that something wasn't implemented that they thought was implemented. There was some assumption, and you know what they say about assumptions.
Right.
Like, or, they're like, wow, this is really important. And if we don't have this like baseline thing, how are we going to be able to move towards, zero trust or a better security posture? So, love everything that you kind of covered there and kind of talked about your experience with that.
Absolutely,
Excited to
Steve.
jump into the demo here.
All right, let's jump right in.
All right. So, Clay, thank you for running through what the workshop like is comprised of, and kind of talking about all the personas that are very valuable to have in the room. I've seen that, a lot of previous engagements that I've had in the past, that are similar to this, that having those personas there like makes all the difference in the world of, you know, folks being able to get additional resources, additional people, kind of understand what they have implemented and what they don't have implemented, and have those folks be like, oh my gosh, like we need a whole lot more to be able to move towards zero trust. So, you know, thank you for weighing in with like your experience around that, because it's great to kind of feel like validated and probably validate a lot of folks that are watching, this episode today. So, with that, really excited to see you dive into the demo.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. So yeah, we're going to dive right in. The first thing that you're going to notice is that, yes, this is in Excel. And I will tell you that I've actually now heard this referred to as the seventh wonder of the Excel world. And, to be honest, it's easier for you to be able to come in and navigate. It's a tool that you're used to. And the great thing about this is that you can actually edit it and make it your own. And you can actually come in if there are boxes that you want to change. Because it's in Excel, you can actually come in here and delete stuff or reword items. It doesn't matter. You can actually change this on your own. Save it. The only thing I ask is that if you do find something that you need to change, for whatever reason, let us know so that we can actually go in and make these changes for everyone. But, I do just want to point out that because it's in Excel, you can actually come in and, edit this document and make it fit your environment and fit your needs. So let me just zoom in here a little bit. And the first thing that you will notice about the devices workshop in particular is that it is very detailed and in-depth. There's a lot here. One of the first things that I always get asked is, hey, where do you start with this workshop, Clay? And honestly, when I'm walking through this with customers, a lot of times I'll start with tenant administration, but then I ask the customer where they want to begin. Could it be, MAM for iOS? Could it be MDM for iOS or Android? And I will tell you that what I found is that 9 out of 10 times, customers say that, hey, let's start with Windows because that's honestly what I'm most worried about in my environment. That's where most of my devices are. And it's where, I want to make sure that, the complexity in our environment that we are, we're actually focusing on the right things. And so I usually will skip down to the Windows section. You'll probably see this move up to the top very soon because of that reason. But, I generally see customers want to start with the MDM for Windows section. And as we go through this, what I normally do is start with Windows enrollment. And we'll actually walk through each one of these boxes and say, hey, where are you on your zero trust journey for this particular item? And one of the things I always tell customers to remember is make sure that you're thinking about this in terms of applying those 3 zero trust principles that we talked about earlier. Verify explicitly, use least privilege access, and assume compromise. So as we're going through this, make sure that you're just, reminding the customer or yourself that, hey, I need to look at this with the zero trust lens. And as I go through, we've made it very easy, not only for you to mark the progress and where you or your customers are on this journey, but what I normally do is for each one of these boxes, if you click your review tab, you're going to see that you can actually take notes for each one of these boxes. And for each box, I'll usually just leave a comment. There's a couple ways to do this. You can either leave a comment. So let's just say, for intro join only, I would put, exactly what the customer or yourself is telling me here. I'm 70% complete, or I'm in planning. These are my blockers. This is why I, can't move these particular sets of devices. I take all of my notes as a comment. The other thing that you could do if you don't like comments is you can actually just take a note and come in here and, use the sticky notes option and take notes for each one of these boxes. I prefer comments just because it gives me all of my notes all in a condensed tab on the right-hand side when I'm done. And then I can turn that into an insight report, which I then send up to my leadership. But there's a lot of different ways that you can do this. But what I generally recommend is that you basically just take notes and comments for each one of the boxes. And as you walk through this, just mark where you are. Mark the things that are working well. Mark the things that are not working well. And as I said, I start with Windows enrollment. With zero trust, one of the first steps is always making sure that you're stopping Azure Directory domain join or legacy domain join, as a lot of people refer to it as, for new workstations. And this is a step that honestly, I would say that I've been pleasantly surprised at how many of my customers have actually completed this. I would say it's a very high percentage now. And if I had asked the same question a couple years ago, I know that my answers would have been very different. Then I go through and look at things like, where are you on your intra join only story? Are you hybrid join today? And if so, what is it going to take to move you to intra only join? And we've actually broken that down in this next row where it's the Windows path to cloud native. And you're going to see on the next row that we've actually broken this down for you. with Windows Path to Cloud Native. In here, you're going to actually be able to walk through each of these boxes with your customers or yourself and just kind of, get an idea of which of these items are keeping you from becoming fully intra-join and cloud native. And the first of these is, migrate group policy to MDM policies. This is something that we get a lot of questions about. It's something that I would probably say is the number one blocker that I hear from customers as, hey, why can't I move to cloud native? And what I found is that customers have so much legacy group policy, Steve. It's kind of crazy. It's there are in some cases I have customers that have 10,000 group policies.
Oh my
And when I ask them the last time that they have gone through and actually, done cleanup on these, it's never a recent date. And, we offer a tool inside Intune that will actually, it's called Group Policy Analytics, that will actually allow you to upload your group policies into Intune. And then we will actually tell you, hey, which of these group policies are actually doing something in your environment today? Which ones are things that honestly haven't even done anything since Windows XP or Windows 7? And you'd be surprised at how many group policies that I see customers deploying that really aren't even doing anything in their environment because they don't work on their current operating systems.
How
And
many shocked faces do you get when they go
so
and run
many.
through their
Yeah,
stuff
so
through
many.
the
And, one of the things that I will say, there's a great blog post that we actually have linked in these documents that actually shows you how to turn your group policy analytics data into a pivot table that makes it very easy to see, legacy group policies, which of those group policies, don't actually do anything. And it kind of puts it into an easy to view format. And, when you start going through that with customers, it really, I think, switches their mindset and they start saying, well, maybe we should even just start greenfield. And I'll tell you that some of the most successful zero trust deployments I've seen and some of the most successful, cloud native journeys that I've seen with customers have been customers that just start greenfield. And these are customers that, are customers that you typically would say, oh, they're going to push back on this for forever. These are banking customers. These are customers in the
wow.
financial services industry. These are customers in, Department of Defense, even that are finally saying, hey, you know what? We have so much legacy policy that we just need to start over and clean things up. And it's absolutely the right way to do things.
I love that the workshop challenges kind of like some of those assumptions. Again, I know we talked about it earlier, but
Yep.
one question that I wanted to ask you that I thought was really interesting about what you called out around the workshop is that a lot of folks start with Windows. Um, I know that my assumption had always been, and maybe it's incorrect, is that Windows would be the place where they're probably the most secure, quote unquote, and that on the mobile side of things or Mac OS side of things or any other kind of operating system other than Windows is where the care and feeding hasn't quite
Right.
been. What has been your experience? Like, let's say they start here with Windows, but then you get to that next section around mobile or anything like that,
Right.
and you're like, whoa, you're not doing anything here, or you're doing the bare minimum. To your point, maybe they implemented MDM or MAM like back in the early days, and there's half the feature set isn't
Right.
implemented like from whatever they're using.
Yeah, Steve, that's a great point. And we do actually see that where, especially where they deployed policy a long time ago, and they actually haven't gone back to look at some of our newer policies. Like in MAM, for example, we have a MAM conditional launch policy that's fairly new, but, it's been around for a few months now. And, I actually, almost every customer I talk to isn't aware that we have a policy to block disabled accounts.
Wow.
And so what, I always say is, hey, let's go check this setting in your tenant as we're going through this, because I'm just curious, this will kind of tell me, what your hygiene looks like, because this is a setting that is a no-brainer that, you absolutely should go set. And every customer, as soon as I explain it to them, they're like, oh yeah, let's go turn that on. Um, but they don't know it's there. It's something that, we release a lot of features in Intune. Honestly, we release more features now in a month than we used to release in a year. So there's a lot to keep up with, and it's just a way to, get them to think about, hey, there's some new settings out there that are actually very impactful. The disabled account setting, for example, in MAM, it's actually going to, allow you to immediately either, block access to your protected apps and your corporate data on from a user account that has been disabled, or you can even wipe the data at the application level, you know, just pull that data off for those apps, you know, without having to go in and really impact the users at all, other than just going and turning that setting on. And it's something that, I'm definitely seeing that there are definitely some settings on iOS, MDM, on MAM, Mac, as you stated, that are, in a lot of cases new. In a lot of cases, customers just don't realize, what the impact is, both for security as well as impact to end users. A lot of times I think it's a lot worse impact than it actually is. So they just don't go turn those things on. But, the reason customers like to start with Windows is because what I've seen is it's honestly the largest part of their estate. We have, customers that have, pretty much close to 100% of their users have a Windows, either, desktop or laptop. Not all of their users choose to get, email or to get access to corporate resources on their mobile devices, especially if it's a BYOD only or bring your own device only environment. A lot of, end users just say, hey, I'm paying for this device. I don't want my corporate resources on here because I don't want my device to be managed. And that's what most companies say is that's up to you. That's okay. But that's really one of the big reasons why we see Windows being the top choices, because there's just so many Windows environment, percentage-wise, so many Windows devices in the environment compared to some of the other device types.
Awesome. So take us through the rest of the Windows section
Yep.
here.
So on Path to Cloud Native, which to me is one of the most important sections, group policy preferences is definitely an area that, we don't have the ability to implement group policy or to deploy group policy preferences like you can in SCCM today within Intune standalone. And this is, something that I do here as a pretty big blocker. But the fact of the matter is, when you start looking at what you're pushing out in group policy preferences, a large percentage of these are going to be legacy items that either don't do anything or really aren't that important. Like you're basically saving your user a step of entering in a piece of information. And a lot of this stuff you could actually push out using a custom OMA URI or basically a custom policy in Intune as well. And we actually see this, it's not too difficult of a hurdle to overcome. It's just going to take the customer going through those group policy preferences and determining, hey, is this something that we should, is it legacy? Is it something that we should just start over with and not require in our new cloud native deployment? File shares to cloud. This is, once again, an area that I've seen most customers have already started or completed this journey. But it is something that, you just have to be aware of as you are moving to cloud native, that if you have on-prem file shares that are, mapped and that your end user are using all the time, you're probably going to need to migrate those to a cloud native drive, like OneDrive, for example, in order to move to cloud native. For app delivery and app compat, once again, this is an area that we have a great story for, in that, we honestly don't see a lot of customers blocked here anymore. And one of the reasons is we actually are working with customers to overcome these hurdles. And if you are, if you're aware of our fast track program at Microsoft, basically any customer, 100 devices or more, as long as you have 100 devices or more, you have access to our fast track program. And as part of that fast track program, we have what's called Desktop App Assure, which we'll make sure to drop the link in comments for. But Desktop App Assure, actually, if you have apps that you're having trouble, moving to, to be modern apps, as long as that is either a first party app, or we'll even work with third party vendors, as long as, the one caveat here is that, we won't help you migrate those apps to modern to the modern app story if it's just a case where there's a new version of that app out and the customer just isn't wanting to pay for that new version of that third party app. That's really the one time when we'll say, no, you need to, upgrade to that new version of the app that is modern. But if it's the only version of the app or the newest version of that app, we will absolutely help you as a company with your line of business apps, or help that third party at no charge. Will actually help you update that app to where you can deploy it with cloud native. And finally, this is definitely one I would put in the top two blockers for moving to cloud native, is moving from WSUS updates and SCCM to auto patch or Windows Update for Business, as it was formerly called. And this is part of the journey where it is a mind shift. You're not going to have the same granular controls that you used to have, with WSUS. But the honest answer to that is you should not be relying on that granular patch, because what that normally tells me is that you're probably making an exception for something that, like an old .NET version that has security vulnerabilities that honestly shouldn't be in your environment, and you should be moving to auto patch or to Windows Update for Business, because if you are looking at those granular exceptions, then there's probably a reason that you're doing so, and that reason is probably that an app requires that old version of .NET. What you should be doing instead is updating your app to rely on the latest version of .NET or whatever the requirement is. Make sure that you're actually going and fixing that problem instead of just making an exception for it in WSUS and in your update strategy. So Steve, that kind of completes a very quick overview for Windows Path to Cloud Native. What I will say is that we actually have one of our Windows deployment experts, Jason Sandys, has just finished a video recording series where he's actually going to be walking through each one of these boxes. And in the next couple of weeks, you're actually going to see videos appearing on each one of these links that's going to walk you through in detail, how we talk about each one of these boxes to our customers. And, highly recommend you check this out in a couple of weeks when we have it delivered. But you're going to have, honestly, one of the people that I consider to be the utmost authorities in Windows deployment in the world is going to actually be walking you through step by step for each one of these boxes on how to actually think about these, in your zero trust journey.
That's awesome. We'll make sure to link our audience to that, as soon as this is published.
Awesome. So let's just jump back really quick to, we skipped down to the path to cloud native when we were talking about intra-only join. Let's just talk about autopilot really quick. If you're not familiar with autopilot, autopilot is basically a way for you to deploy your operating system to users for Windows that is basically going to replace some of your legacy toolkits, like the Microsoft Deployment Toolkit for deploying your entire operating system and images of your devices. We're moving away from that model to what we call autopilot user deployment. And autopilot is a way for you to actually automate this deployment in a modern way. So instead of you pushing down, a gigabytes worth of images and apps all in one go before a user gets a device, with autopilot, it's basically going to take the base image of Windows and it's going to add to that. So basically you're going to be able to choose, hey, I want to start with this particular version of Windows. Then I want to make sure that all of my security patches have been deployed. Then I want to push these particular applications out before the user gets the device. I want to, set these security configurations before the user gets the device. And it's going to push that out, as the user logs in for the first time. And it's going to, with autopilot user enrollment, it's going to actually allow you to deploy these, as I said, as the user is logging in, it's going to just pop up a screen that says, hey, we're getting your device ready for you. And then when everything is pushed down and ready for them to go, the user is going to be able to log in and start using their device. You can ship the device directly from the manufacturer. You don't have to send it to your headquarters first and then have it, re-imaged. You can literally just send them the device. They open it up out of the box. They go to log in for the first time, and it's going to know, because this device is registered with your company, which apps to push down, which policies to push down, which security configurations to push down, based on the user that's logging into that device for the first time. It doesn't matter where they are. They can be anywhere in the world, and they're going to have this same experience. We also have what we call autopilot pre-provisioning. This is where if you do want to, have that device shipped to your headquarters first, your IT department can actually prep this device before it gets into the end user. So if you don't want that user to have to wait for all their apps and policies to get pushed down during the first login, you can actually have that stuff get pushed down before the user gets the device. So when they get the device, it just, basically boots up to the desktop. And the great thing about this is that the person setting up the device and provisioning the device never even knows what's being pushed down. They don't know what apps are being pushed down. All they have to do is scan a barcode, and it's going to know which user is assigned, and it's then going to push those apps, those policies down to the device. They're going to scan a barcode again. They're going to rebox the device and then ship it to the end user, and it's going to be fully ready to go and prepared before, as the user first opens the box. That being said, we do have a new version of Autopilot that is, I won't say a new version, we have a updated Autopilot type or deployment type that is called Autopilot Device Preparation. And Autopilot Device Preparation is basically a way for us to streamline the entire autopilot process. One thing I will call out on this, and a lot of people get hung up on this because they don't realize this and they didn't read the docs, but I just want to call out that this does require your devices to be cloud native. This will not work on a hybrid join device. It is only for cloud native Windows devices, but it does attempt to streamline the autopilot provisioning process and it basically makes things a lot smoother for the end user experience as they first get their device. So this is normally covered in the identity section of the workshop in detail, but I do just want to mention that, with Windows Hello for Business and passwordless authentication, this is absolutely the way to go for your modern devices, for your Windows devices. And passwordless is something that a few years ago was kind of like a pipe dream that everyone thought that we should be going this direction. But I can tell you that now, even at Microsoft, I can't tell you the last time I've had to put in a password. It's probably been a couple of years. I actually went the other day and looked, and the last time I've had to actually update my password was 5.5 years ago. As our CISO made the decision that, hey, it's honestly more secure to not require password rotation and to actually just get rid of passwords in general. We started to really see a huge uptick in our customers that are moving to passwordless as they start to see Microsoft move to passwordless, which we've been that way for a couple of years now. We are starting to see a lot of our customers move this way as well. And I can't stress the importance here because, passwords are honestly legacy. They're what the attackers go after. And the best way to eliminate that is just to eliminate passwords and to eliminate that threat of passwords in your environment and the threat of those getting actually compromised. So just get rid of passwords. And with Windows Hello for Business, you can there's multiple different ways that you can log into your Windows devices with Windows Hello for Business, but I highly recommend you consider this as an option and move away from using passwords on your Windows devices across your environment. Okay, Steve, so we've gone through, in my opinion, one of the two most difficult sections of Windows deployment as part of the workshop already. And just to show you, hey, this really isn't difficult. Walking through this is an exercise it's not going to take you that much time. It's going to take a few hours out of your day, but it's just so important to actually just go through and map these things and make sure that you're thinking about each one of these steps on your Zero Trust journey. The next part we're going to talk about is co-management. So, with co-management, this is, basically moving from SCCM or ConfigMan, as it's called today, to Intune. And, this is a journey that a lot of customers still haven't made today. So we wanted to kind of walk through each one of the sliders, as we will, for co-management. So as you start your co-management journey, as you start thinking about moving from SCCM or ConfigMan to Intune, what you're going to be able to do is actually start, moving workloads one piece at a time over to Intune. And this is all very easy to do. This is, once again, there's almost no impact to just go flip the switch that connects SCCM to Intune. And when you start doing that, you're going to start getting all of the data from SCCM for each of your devices is going to start flowing into Intune. So you can actually go into your Intune console and start doing a lot of the, remote actions and a lot of the things that you could only do in SCCM before. Once you flip the switch for what we, call co-management, you can actually start doing a lot of those actions in the Intune console for your SCCM managed devices. Once again, when you first turn the switch over, there's not going to be any impact other than the fact that you're going to be able to start doing things from the Intune console. Now, the ultimate goal is to actually move management from SCCM or ConfigMan over to Intune over a certain period of time. And so with co-management, what you can start to do is you start turning these knobs. If you look at the co-management tab inside SCCM, you're going to start seeing workloads. And these are compliance policies, device configuration, Office apps, client apps, and Windows updates. You don't have to turn all these things on at once, and you don't have to turn them on for all of your devices at once. So let's just take compliance policies as an example, because when we're thinking about zero trust, this is one of the most important things that you can ever do is actually give yourself the ability to apply a compliance policy to your devices, which then can be enforced by a conditional access policy. And so with the compliance policy slider in co-management, what you can do is say, hey, I'm going to start a test group and I'm going to just turn on compliance policies for a certain number of my Windows devices. And you basically just target a collection in SCCM to start applying these compliance policies. And, once you're, feel comfortable that, hey, I'm not going to have that much of an impact on my end user estate. I'm not going to have, 50% of my devices be blocked because they're out of compliance when I turn this switch on. You can start to move more collections into that test group. You can also then start saying, hey, maybe I'm at the point where I can just move everything over from SCCM. I can just start moving all those devices over to Intune only management. And once again, you can divide each one of these sections. You can apply this on an individual section basis. You can if you want to start with Office apps, and honestly, deploying Office apps in Intune is so much easier than it is deploying them in ConfigMan. In ConfigMan, it's something like 27 steps to set up an Office app deployment, where in Intune you go through and check like 3 or 4 checkboxes and hit deploy and choose the groups that you want to apply it to, and you're done. It's that simple. And so Office apps is an area that I honestly see a lot of customers starting with. But basically you choose the things that you want to move over. And let's say that, hey, you got through all 4 of these items and you don't want to move over to Windows Update or Auto Patch yet. That's okay. You can, until you get ready to move, you don't have to move those workloads over. You can still continue to manage those in SCCM and ConfigMan just like you are today, with no change to what you're doing today. Other than the fact that you're also going to be able to see that data, for those updates and patches in your Intune console. That's honestly the only change you're going to see until you start moving these slider bars. But once again, the ultimate goal is to eventually move those workloads over to Intune. We're not going to spend a lot of time on resource access today, but the short version here is that when you look at your Windows resources that you're pushing out, like your certs, your Wi-Fi profiles, these are things that you should eventually move over to Intune. Your VPN policies, with zero trust. One of the things that I honestly see here is when customers were deploying this, deploying are managing their Windows devices in SCCM or in other tools that are on-prem based, they had to push out a VPN. It was required. So you'll see VPN be the baseline policy for all users in an environment. You have to move away from that mindset. With a zero trust mindset, you honestly should be trying to do your best to move away from a VPN dependency. The network perimeter as your security perimeter, that whole concept has been dying, and to me, it's dead. It's not the way to protect your environment. With a zero trust mindset, you need to be thinking, hey, how do I get rid of this need to have my devices check in or connect to on-prem resources via VPN? Because that's what the attackers are looking for. They're looking for a way to get inside your firewall. And if you have a VPN policy on those devices, that's what they're going to be looking for. And so my suggestion to you is, as you're going through your zero trust journey, try to think, every single one of these boxes, think, hey, is this something that I really need today? Is this something that I need for all users, or do I just have one set of users that still requires, on-prem access for, a certain, network drive, or a certain application that requires, access to an on-prem database? That's really the question you need to be asking yourself is, can I, at least limit the scope and limit the risk of having a VPN applied to all users by just targeting the users that absolutely need it? The next one is, enterprise browser. And this is an area that, I also have customers say, well, no, we just don't really do anything here. And we want our users to be able to choose, what they can use. We haven't really settled on a browser. And what I say is, you're honestly doing yourself a disservice and you're giving yourself a lot more work, because you do need to apply restrictions at the browser level. You need to be able to apply, no matter which browser you choose. It could be Chrome. We always, of course, hope that you choose Edge as your enterprise browser, but you need to be able to apply configurations and security controls to that browser. In order to do so, it is by far the best practice to actually decide on an enterprise browser, so you don't have to, apply these, come up with controls for 5 different browsers, and you don't have to worry, about the user experience for browsers, because you're going to be testing this. You're going to know, what's going to be impactful to your users. You're going to know, what you need to do to make that user experience better for your users. So my suggestion here is just choose an enterprise browser as part of your zero trust strategy. Take that as an opportunity to make that decision. For VDI, this is an area that we have a lot of customers that are moving to VDI. To me, honestly, VDI is the future. So if you were to ask me, in an ideal world, what would a zero trust device look like, Clay? I'd say, you know what? To me, a zero trust device in a perfect world would be a Windows 365 device that has a MAM policy applied to the Windows app, so that you're applying restrictions for a unmanaged device accessing that Windows 365 environment. But you can also then apply all of your same security controls via Intune to those Windows 365 environments. That user can access that environment no matter where they are. And it's honestly a direction that I see a lot of customers moving, especially for remote employees, where, hey, you know what? I'm not going to provide you a standard, $2,000 device anymore. At the most, I'm going to provide you a, couple $100 laptop that is, not necessarily the fastest machine on the market, but it doesn't matter, because the processing and the basically the workload is all being transferred to that Windows 365 VDI or virtual device. And Steve, just curious, I know that with your customers, a lot of them are on their zero trust journey. Do you see a lot of customers, implementing VDI today, either Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because A lot of customers, to your point, they see a lot of value in commoditizing things, making it so that it's more wrapped up like experience rather than some of the things that you've called out in here, where they need to, you know, prepare all of these different things to go and prep like a thick client, and have to do all the management around that versus, a commoditized service or a half commoditized service where, maybe they don't have to manage all the base level stuff, like you were talking about Azure Virtual Desktops. I see a lot of, customers I work with or organizations that I have friends at adopting that because they get the best of both worlds. They get all the customizability of choosing how everything's set up, but they don't have to deal with the networking, all of the core resources that support that deployment that people are worried about when they hear the words VDI
Right.
and all the cost that comes with that. Or, I see there's quite a few customers that have been starting to look at Windows 365 because it is that all wrapped up
Right.
offering, where they can add minimal, touch to those environments, but still get a secure native desktop experience for their end users. So it's been a mix of both, and then I've still got customers that are utilizing, things like VMware and, all of the
Sure.
other kind of previous offerings that have kind of been out there, but there's been a lot more appetite to evaluate, just like you're talking about in this workshop, does what we're doing make sense anymore? Like, or should we accelerate towards this other thing, or should we double down on this thing that we've been testing and kind of only noodling about? So,
Right.
um, that's a great question, Clay. I appreciate you asking.
Yeah, and it's something honestly, Steve, that I'm seeing, with these workshops. I've given a lot of these workshops now, and what I'm seeing is that, customers like this workshop because we're not dictating, hey, you should go buy this Microsoft product. We're actually just saying, hey, think about this. Think about your VDI strategy. No matter what you're using, think about, applying that zero trust lens to your VDI strategy. Think about how you could actually use your virtual environments to further your zero trust story and, in your zero trust deployment journey. And it is something that I am hearing a lot from customers says, it's honestly something that I haven't thought about. And going through this, it just makes me realize I do need to go back and let's revisit that. Maybe we have been doing things, in a way that is just fit for us because of the way we've been doing it for 15 years, and maybe it's time to go and rethink those decisions. And once again, we're not telling you that you're bad or you're wrong by not doing those things. We're just trying to say, hey, start thinking about these things and start thinking about these things with a zero trust lens. All right. So that's really, I spend a lot of time in those three lines of the Zero Trust Workshop. And so that's why I wanted to kind of deep dive in those. We're going to kind of jump through a couple of these other items just to make sure that you're aware they're here. And we will be moving a little bit quicker as we go through the last portion of the workshop. But a couple of things I just want to call out, that are top of mind for me is one, as you're going through and you start looking and you start marking a lot of these items as like third parties. So let's say that you're using, a third party endpoint privilege management product, or you're using third party remote help. One thing that I will say, and this is, if you're a partner or if you're doing this on your own, doesn't really matter. One thing I will say is that if you're looking to, hopefully purchase something like Intune Suite in the future, this is actually a good way to get buy-in from your leadership. When they start to see that, hey, I'm using all these third-party products, and they start to visualize this, I will tell you that, I have just seen so many customers that at the very least will start a POC of these third-party products. And they'll start, looking at them and saying, hey, maybe this is something that we could consolidate on a single vendor for, like Microsoft or whoever you choose. But, as you start going through this, just be aware that, it could be a way for you to get buy-in from your leadership, or, to get buy-in from your customer that, hey, maybe it is time that we start at least evaluating consolidating into a single product like Intune Suite or IntraSuite, instead of purchasing and paying for all these third-party products again whenever it's time to reevaluate licensing. For the security section here, we talked a little bit about compliance policy earlier when we were talking about the slider for conditional access, or slider for co-management. But just want to reiterate that, to me, this is one of those areas that if I were to pick one thing that I would say, make sure you're doing this with Zero Trust, it is compliance policy for devices. It's the one thing that I say has to be there. And Steve, you'd actually be surprised at how many customers that I've gone through with, and I say, okay, well, let's talk about your compliance policy. Let's go look at your compliance policy, and we'll look at it in the, configuration that we talked about a little bit earlier. When we start evaluating the compliance policy, I'm like, hey, your compliance policy looks great. You're keeping this up to date. You have the latest operating system, N-5 or whatever the latest operating system is as your base model for compliance, basically requiring that all your devices be at or above that particular OS level. You have, all the controls that you should have here. And then I say, well, just to make sure, you do have a conditional access policy set to block not compliant devices, correct? And I've actually been shocked. And I will admit that sometimes my mouth kind of drops and says, wait, you don't have a conditional access policy blocking not compliant devices. And they say, well,
no.
yes, yes. And I'm not talking only small customers either. I'm talking very large customers. And when I ask, well, okay, I'm just curious why, because this is something we definitely need to correct. And every time the answer is, well, it's too much impact on our end users.
What's
And
the point?
yeah, and that's my exact response is, there's honestly, I'm baffled by this, but at the same time, there are reasons like, end user experience that some of my customers just say, hey, that's something we can't do. And my response is, no, that is something you can do. You have to go do this. And I will say that 100% of the customers that I've had this conversation with at least within a few weeks, a lot of times they have to go through change control process, which is what you should be doing. They'll go and change this, but make sure that you have a conditional access policy to block not compliant devices. And we actually have a new conditional access policy template now that will allow you to deploy or require compliance policy on for all of your users across all their devices. With just a few checkboxes. If you go to conditional access, you will see conditional access templates now, and there is a Zero Trust template. Highly recommend you go turn on that template and block not compliant devices in your environment. The other thing I'll say about compliance policy is make sure you're doing your hygiene. While a lot of customers are keeping up with it, there are definitely customers out there that didn't even know that they needed to be keeping up with hygiene on their compliance policy. And it's something that, you have to do. It's more important to me than any other policy in your environment. Make sure that you are going in to Intune and, the security tab and, or your devices tab, and make sure that you're updating your compliance policy for every operating system type, just to make sure that you're keeping up to date. We're constantly adding, new features there, new things that you can add to your compliance policy. For Windows, we actually have a custom compliance policy option now, where if there's something that we don't have in our base compliance policy that you would like to, key on. So let's say you had a third-party firewall that you wanted to make sure was enabled and on that device, or even configured a certain way, you can actually write a script that will go and look for that particular thing on a device. And if it is not there, if it's not found, or if it's not configured correctly, it's actually going to mark that device as not compliant and then block access to the corporate resources until the end user remediates that issue. And the great thing about custom compliance policy is we even let you write a custom JSON script that will basically walk them through how to remediate that particular issue, including links. You can actually say, hey, you need this particular app or this particular registry key, etc. And we're actually going to allow, we actually allow you today to go in and create a custom remediation script for that user where they can actually click through and say, hey, oh, I need to go do this to get access to my resources again.
So Clay, I wanted to ask you a couple of things
Sure.
about that. Since this is a zero trust workshop, um, I feel like, there's two things I want to dial into. One is the user experience piece that you were talking about, which
Yeah.
I think is super critical, like to all of this, because we all know just putting in a block for the sake of putting in a block for the sake of security is gonna
Yeah.
just blow up in your face, and it's not gonna be a good time for anybody. But at the same token, on the flip side of it, it's like if you're doing all of this work and then there's no kind of like, I call it like the belt and suspenders piece of it, like what's the point of doing all of the work if one of your
Yeah.
devices falls out of compliance, or somebody, whether maliciously or inadvertently modifies, the security posture on a device. If you're not putting in device compliance and enforcing it, with the things you were just talking about, um, I'd argue that all of the stuff that you're doing at this point is just for naught. Like it's not,
Yeah.
almost, you could almost argue that it's pointless.
I would honestly agree with you, Steve. I guess the politically correct way to say it would be, well, at least you're observing it, but at the same time,
Yeah.
you're really setting yourself up for failure, and you're really setting yourself up to be compromised. You have to have automatic blocks in place, like conditional access policies. You have to have a compliance policy that is actually going and checking to make sure that things are secure and up to date on the device, and that you have things as simple as having a screen lock or a PIN or password requirement on that device. You have to have those things, and it's something that um, it's it's as I said, kind of baffling to me why customers would ever take the journey to even create a compliance policy if they're not going to be taking action on it. But we've
Yes.
seen it, and at the same time, it's something that shouldn't happen. And so once again, as you go through this, make sure that you are, as Steve said, like don't set yourself up for failure. Make sure that you are actually, putting teeth behind your compliance policy and blocking not compliant devices.
Yeah, and I love your call out about, the JSONs, that kind of are spit out around this to provide a pathway to remediation,
Yeah,
and like and all of that, because that's key, right? Like anytime we can arm somebody like with the things that they need to ultimately provide back to the folks that fall outside of these policies and get back into, a known good state, like that's a huge win. Like that's a huge win because that's not custom collateral that they have to go and build or anything like that. And then the other piece, and I'm sure that you've got your own share of kind of war stories around this, but I've worked at organizations where they weren't creating the right compliance policies and they weren't enforcing the teeth around, the compliance policies that they had in place. One organization I worked at, a higher level HR representative left their laptop in a taxi. And we're
oof,
like, oh, we're enforcing drive encryption, across our estate. So unless they know her credentials, they're not going to be able to get into her device. Lo and behold, one of the compliance policies that was not in scope of all of this was ensuring that drive encryption was being enforced, across the organization. So it was a fire drill,
yeah,
about, oh, what data did she have on her laptop, because we didn't have drive encryption on that laptop, or we couldn't confirm it because there was no compliance policy.
right.
So, so
Absolutely, Steve. And honestly, compliance policy is one of those things that you can't just apply to the users that you think have important data, because you're going to miss important data. And one example that I can give that I know from a firsthand experience is, a um, customer that had it was an iPad in this particular case, but there was an iPad that was dropped, and there at the time there was no compliance policy on this because this was someone that was in facilities and
Oh
maintenance. It
no.
was a maintenance person, and they when we started asking like, hey, what type of data, your maintenance, we're probably cool here because you don't have like the super sensitive financial data of our company on here. You don't have, if you worked in a hospital or healthcare environment, you wouldn't have patient data. You're in facilities. And they asked the question, what data is on your iPad? And the response from the facilities person was, well, not much. Actually, I did have the blueprints for every one of our buildings on that iPad.
Oh no.
And this is something that, it to me really opened my eyes to compliance policy isn't for, just a select few people in your environment that you think have the most important data. Compliance policy needs to be applied to everyone in your environment. Compliance policy needs to be applied to all of your users, no exceptions. Um, it could be anyone. And so that's something that I just, want to make sure that everyone is thinking about as they are looking at compliance policy, conditional access policy. Make sure that you are applying it to all users.
Awesome. Thank you, Clay.
Yeah. So the only other area I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about a couple things here. Security baselines. Steve, you mentioned, hey, how do I make sure that I'm not tightening the knobs too tightly for all of my users? And security baselines is honestly one of those areas where you can fall into that trap where, if you apply our security baselines, these are Microsoft security baselines, which are our recommendations based on our own experiences as well as experiences of our enterprise customers that we think are the knobs that you need to turn to make that device fully secure. That being said, for a lot of environments, some of these might be considered too heavy-handed and are going to have impact on end-user experience. So this is one area where I would recommend to go through, and even if you turn them on, which I suggest you doing, turn on security baselines, but before you actually deploy it to all users, start deploying with a test group and start tweaking the settings. You can actually go after you turn everything on, you can go through and turn things off and just find that right balance between end user productivity and security. Because as I said, this is a lot of times for our, these are what we consider our security baselines that we turn on. And a lot of these are going to be kind of heavy handed for your standard user. So they could have impact. So just make sure you're going and reviewing those and not turning on, everything for all users all at once. The last thing I'll cover in the Windows security section is endpoint privilege management. This to me is, when it comes to zero trust, probably the most important feature that you can turn on today. Just looking at a lot of the threats that we see with ransomware, et cetera, that could be installed using, administrative accounts on a device. And what endpoint privilege management allows you to do is basically get rid of the need for a user to be full administrator on a device. And it's going to allow you to choose the applications that can be installed by an end user and then allow them to elevate their permissions using just in time and just enough access to where for that one particular application, they can elevate for a certain amount of time. There's a lot of different elevation methods they could use. It could be through a help desk ticket. It could be a automatic elevation. It could be through a right-click tool. There's a lot of different ways that you can require elevation, but once they elevate, they're only going to be able to install that one particular app on their device only for a certain period of time. And then after that, they're going to go back to a standard user profile, which is not going to have the ability to install apps again. And it's, once again, it's only going to allow you to install those approved apps that you choose. So that way, when your end user does inevitably click on, the ransomware link and that goes to install an executable on their device, it's actually going to block that install from ever occurring. I will say that this does require the Intune Suite licensing, which is part of our Intune. Well, it's EPM is part of our Intune Suite, which does require an additional licensing cost. But to me, this is worth its weight in gold. You're probably, hopefully, already paying for a third party to do this today. And so just to call out that it might be something you want to consider using in your environment, especially if you're deploying zero trust, because administrative users on devices is how you're going to get owned. It's how you're going to get ransomware installed on your devices, and it's honestly going to ruin your day. So the way to mitigate that is to, get rid of administrative users on across all your devices. It doesn't matter to me if it is a developer, doesn't matter to me if it's a administrator who knows everything, exactly what they're doing and everything they're clicking on. I don't have administrative rights on my device. And, when I need to install something, I go through the endpoint privilege management process to elevate and get permission to install that app. And with just in time and just enough access, and I'm happy with that. It's honestly, it makes me know that I don't have to worry as much about clicking on the wrong link, because I know that it's not going to be able to install malicious software on my device, if I do ever go down that path, which I hope I don't. We were not going to go through each one of these, but for Windows updates, make sure that you are using auto patch and Windows updates on your devices. An area that a lot of customers, in fact, I was just doing a workshop yesterday, and a customer didn't know. They said, well, right now we're actually manually going through and updating drivers and firmware. We actually do have the option to update driver to basically manage driver and firmware updates now within Intune, including for some third parties like Lenovo. So definitely check out driver and firmware updates if you have not done so. There's, once again, information in the links where you can go see how to do that. Remote help, delivery optimization, these are all items that you should go through as you're walking through this workshop on your own or with your customers. Make sure that you're talking through these, but for the sake of this podcast, we're just going to say, hey, the rest of these things are very important, but we're not going to go through each one of the boxes. And we're going to, move on to some of the other areas. At the bottom, you're going to see here Mac OS. Once again, there are a lot of very similar items here with as you see in Windows Estate. But I will tell you, Steve, one of the other big things that I've been shocked by with customers is how many customers are not managing their Macs at all. Like zero management of Macs.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, and I've lived through Mac malware in environments. I've seen it take down in almost entire organizations, and it's something that you have to think about. You have to think about securing your Macs. You need to make sure that they're encrypted. You need to make sure, once again, compliance policy is applied and enforced on those Macs. You need to make sure that they're up to date. And once again, this workshop will allow you to walk through these things, even if you're using, Intune plus Jamf, for example. It's something that you have to make sure that you are managing your Macs. And, with Intune, we've come a long way with Mac management. If you haven't looked in a while, definitely check us out. And I think you'll be very surprised at how far we've come with Mac management. And, with things like Platform SSO, where you can actually have single sign-on across, now your Mac estate and your Mac apps as well. Definitely, and I wouldn't even say consider, I would say, please go, today and start at least building test policies for your Macs, because you need to protect your Macs just as much as you need to protect any other device in your estate.
I think what I love about the Mac OS story is that we are partnering, we're meeting customers where they're at, and so partnering with like Jamf, who even Apple utilizes to manage their Mac OS.
It's a great product.
So I think that's such a cool call out, in the workshop here, because again, it just shows the value of kind of meeting better together, meeting customers where they're at. So
yep.
I love the.
And even if you're using Jamf to manage your Macs, that's awesome. But make sure you're actually creating a compliance policy in Intune and then connecting your Jamf instance to your Intune instance, because even Jamf managed devices can apply intra-conditional access policy and Intune compliance policy. And basically, Intune is going to pull that information from Jamf and use it to evaluate the compliance policy, and then conditional access can block access to the same resources, even if that, just like that device was managed via Intune, you can do it for your Jamf managed devices.
Yeah. Uh, Thank you for the call out on that. Back to you.
All right. Yep. So as we start to wrap up here, when we look at some of the other areas of the console or of the workshop that I like to focus on, MAM is a big one. And I will say that, MAM policy for iOS and Android is pretty similar. So you'll probably see these two sections combined here before too long. But that being said, just make sure you're going into your console and creating a MAM policy. Like for me, MAM is exponentially going to increase your security posture at almost no impact to your end users. It's not like full MDM on your devices where basically you have to sign over your firstborn in order to get access to resources. You're going to get that scary pop-up. If you're doing full MDM, you're going to get a scary pop-up that says, your company can access all these things and list off like 15 things, even if that your company isn't actually accessing those things because they have those features turned off. Apple is going to tell them that there is the possibility that they could access those things. And it's scary to end users. It's something that, an end user doesn't want their employee to see everything that, from their phone. They don't want them to have everything, access to everything on their phone. Even if they don't really, that message from Apple makes it seem like they do. And with MAM, the only pop-up they're going to get is basically saying, hey, your organization is managing the data within this app. You need to reboot it. And then when it reboots, the first time they go to log in, they will have to log in, and it's going to allow you to require a app level PIN on those apps. And or you could use facial recognition or biometrics, doesn't matter. But once again, this is at the application level. So even if that device isn't managed, you can actually, protect the corporate data within the apps that you care about. So, basically any app that can apply the Intune SDK. This is all the Microsoft apps like Office, etc. This is a whole list of third-party apps, which is growing by the month. Things like, Box or Adobe or Zoom. You can actually apply Intune MAM policy to those applications at the app level. And it's something that I try to tell, all my customers, like, hey, I've been through deployments with hundreds of thousands of users, and every single one of them thinks it's going to be this huge event where they're going to get, thousands and thousands of help desk calls, and there ends up being like less than a handful of support calls. Everything that does come in could actually have just been handled with setting up a Teams channel saying, hey, here's a couple things that you might want to look out for. And every single time it ends up being a non-event where it's not going to impact your end users, and you're actually going to be able to start protecting your data at the application level, even if that device is not MDM managed. The other thing I like to point out is it doesn't matter if let's say you're using a third-party MDM. That's fine. We can still apply those same protections at the application layer. The only difference if you're using a third-party MDM is that, if you're using Intune as your MDM provider, we can actually only require the app level PIN if the device does not have a device level PIN set through MDM. So for a third party, you would have the device level PIN and the app level PIN, which is honestly not that big of a deal, especially when you think about biometrics. I mean, it's something that the end user is going to be used to doing anyway. And it's only when they go to open these protected apps. With a third party app, you're going to have two pins. With if you're using Intune as your management platform for MDM, then you can basically just have a device level PIN and not require that second app level PIN on a managed device. It's still going to require it if that device is unmanaged, but it's not going to require that app level PIN if the device is managed by Intune and has a device PIN set through Intune. The other thing I'll call out here is third-party keyboards. And Steve, this is something that, it's something that it's definitely up to the company to choose this. But I always like to ask, as I'm walking through this workshop, who's ever read the EULA for third-party keyboards on their iOS device? And EULA's end user license agreement. Have you ever read it, Steve?
No, but that is brutal.
Yeah. So it's actually pretty eye-opening, and I suggest everyone listening to this podcast go open up your device, go install a third-party keyboard, and you're going to see this end user license agreement pop up. And if you read this second line here, it actually says these keyboards can access all the data you type, including bank account and credit card numbers, street addresses, as well as other personal and sensitive information. If you keep on reading, it even says even if you disable access, it can actually cache that data and send it to their servers when it's turned back on. And there's a lot of industries where, this is something that I think it should at least be considered for highly sensitive environments, financial services industries. And we actually allow you to turn that off at the application level and say, hey, I'm going to block third-party keyboards, when you're accessing your apps. And, it's something that I highly recommend that companies at least consider turning this on, because I've never had a single customer that has said that they've read this EULA. Maybe it just shows how much of a nerd I am that I did go and read it one time, and I started lobbying for us to have that functionality added from Apple for an API to block third-party keyboards.
Awesome.
But it's something that, I highly recommend you at least go read that EULA and consider whether or not that's something you could turn on in your environment. For MAM though, we do have a set of recommended settings for MAM. If you click on this data protection framework link, it'll actually take you to some scripts that you can run to create a test policy. It's not going to apply it to your users. You still have to do that, but it will at least give you kind of a framework of the most recommended the settings that we most recommend to secure your environment for mobile application management. But once again, as you go through this MAM section, it's just make sure that you go through and think about each one of these sections. Earlier, we talked about the disabled account piece, which is under the disabled account setting, which is under conditional launch in your MAM settings. Try, to go through each setting and determine whether or not you should turn this on for your end users. At the very least, start with some sort of MAM policy, at least requiring an app level PIN, which will also enable things like, app level encryption on iOS. And other, just kind of no-brainer options like being able to wipe application data from a device that's been sitting dormant in a drawer somewhere for 100 days. Make sure that you go set a conditional launch setting that's going to basically say, hey, after this certain amount of days, I'm going to actually go wipe the application data. The only impact to end users, if that happens, they're not going to lose any data. They're not going to lose the pictures on their phone of their grandkids. All they're going to have to do is log in fully the next time, and it's going to basically pull that data back down. But they're going to have to go through MFA. Hopefully, if you have that set up, which you should, they're going to have to go through the MFA process and the login process to basically launch that app and get access to those resources again. They're not going to lose any data. So that's the short version of MAM. Steve, any questions on application management, or is there anything that you're curious about or that you've seen with MAM deployments with customers that you've worked with?
Yeah, no, I just want to echo some of the things that you mentioned around MAM. I found customers that I've talked to that are still not aware of MAM, and that it can be deployed as kind of that light touch, around a lot of different things. Because again, enrolling your device in MDM, it gives you all the scary prompts on iOS and Android, where it's like, Android less so, but, on iOS, it's very much like, they will have full control over your device, blah, 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 blah. I love MAM as that alternative, kind of out there, where it's like, I want to give employees, contractors, anybody access to my company's resources, or at least email at the very least, without requiring full management of their device. And
Absolutely.
I think the call outs from a user experience perspective that you made are super valuable. And cool that, you were nerding out about the third party keyboards and, because I've seen a lot of security research on third party keyboards and all of that and kind of what they introduce. I know that manufacturers have kind of stepped up their game on keyboard functionality so that they're less necessary, but yeah, I have not read a EULA for that, so that was eye-opening for me.
Yeah.
But
Everyone I've talked to, Steve, it's not just you. Everyone, it says the same thing.
I was like, oh gosh, so, but
Absolutely. And I did, as you were going through that, I did want to call out one other thing, and that is that we can actually, with MAM, a lot of customers don't know this either. They know that we can, as part of your compliance policy for iOS or Android, you can basically require a first-party Microsoft or third-party mobile threat defense product. There's a lot of them out there. I won't name them all because I know I'll forget one, and then someone will ask me why I didn't mention that one. But there's a lot of them out there, and we actually have the ability for any of those third-party mobile threat defense products that we support. You can actually set a minimum device threat level and say, hey, I'm going to require that, Defender for iOS be installed on this device, for example, and I'm going to require that it be at either, below medium or below for the threat level. And we can actually block access at the application level, even if the device isn't fully managed. We can still block access to those resources if that mobile threat defense product says that that device is at a high risk level, or whatever you set your minimum threat level to. We can actually block access at the application level based on the telemetry we're getting from that third party or Defender mobile threat defense product. Okay, Steve, I just looked at the time. I realize I have like 5 minutes left.
That's okay. If you
Um,
need to take,
so
if you need to take 10 minutes, like it's all good. Like
okay,
again, we can
okay.
edit this.
So
Like,
we might just say we'll just keep this short because I think I actually do have a customer call. So give me
how
just,
dare you?
yeah, I'm so sorry. I did not realize how close I was to time. Okay, so all right, let me just take a quick drink here. Okay, so Steve, I know we're getting close on time, so I do just want to, call out a couple of things for MDM for iOS and Android. This is another section that each MDM for iOS and MDM for Android have their own sections in the workshop. And a lot of this is going to look very similar to what we looked at with Windows and Mac. So we don't have to drain each one of these boxes, but just want to call out once again how important compliance policy is, how important it is to have a conditional access policy that blocks not compliant devices for both iOS and Android. You have to go do this. Like if I were to say, what's the one thing that you have to do when it comes to zero trust for devices, like above all else? Like there's a lot you should do. What's the one thing that you should do first? It's definitely compliance and conditional access policy. You have to go do that. The other is enrollment restrictions. This is once again setting those minimum set of requirements for a device to even enroll in the service. And this is something that, once again, hygiene is very important, making sure that you're keeping up to date with that minimum OS version. You do have the option to even set a maximum OS version. Let's say you didn't want your end users to be able to go install the latest iOS version, for example, because let's say there's some AI features in there that don't have an API yet, within Apple that's been made available through products like Intune, where you can actually go restrict access to some of those things. Let's just say you wanted to block access to beta versions of iOS, for example. You can actually set a maximum version for enrollment restrictions, for compliance policy. And it's something that, once again, at least consider in your environment, especially if you have highly sensitive data. I do see a lot of our government agencies and governments across the world actually implementing maximum levels for their OS version numbers. Just something to consider, and a lot of people don't think about. Mobile threat defense. I can't stress how important it is to have mobile threat defense products on your devices. There are there's malware, there are threats, there are man-in-the-middle attacks, for iOS, for Android, and they're a lot more prevalent than people think. And I've seen a lot of them in the wild. I've seen a lot of customers actually get owned by these attacks. And to me, I would love for you to go purchase and install Defender for Endpoint. What I'm saying here is install something, install a first or third party mobile threat defense product, please at least consider requiring this as part of your device management strategy for fully enrolled devices, because it's something that is going to save it's going to save you time and money in the long run. And it's something that you just have to do these days. There's too many threats out there, and it's something that, once again, we're basically taking telemetry from those mobile threat defense products and feeding that into the compliance policy to make decisions as to whether or not your end user should get access to your corporate resources. And it's just something that you have to do today. It's not a question of should you, it's you have to. It's so important. For app deployment for iOS, for Android, definitely make sure that you are, updating your catalogs for apps so that your end users don't have to go looking on, the internet for, some version of something or a workaround to get a paid version of something. Make sure that you're, if with VPP, you can actually pay for those apps in advance for your end users so they don't have to go and pay for it. You can, deploy that licensing as part of the app deployment. Definitely something that if you're not doing today, you should consider doing, both for iOS and Android. For enrollment, for your corporate managed devices, I highly recommend Apple Business Manager provisioning, where, this is going to be tied to their Apple account. Their Apple account is going to be tied to their corporate account. And basically, they're going to be enrolling those devices using Apple Business Manager provisioning, which will actually allow you to, for your corporate owned devices, perform a lot stricter policies, or to deploy a lot stricter policies to those devices. Whereas on personal devices, Apple and Google both restrict, what you can actually lock down on those devices. With Apple Business Manager provisioning, you can actually do a lot more when it comes to tightening and strengthening your security posture on those devices. There's a lot more settings available to you today if you're using Apple Business Manager provisioning. And the other thing I'll just call out really quickly are things like shared iPad and intra-shared device mode. If you go, click on these links inside the workshop, it's actually going to tell you the difference between, what's the difference between shared device mode and shared iPad mode. So you have that information at your fingertips, and once again, these are things that if you're doing things like frontline worker devices, you're probably going to want to consider deploying in either intra-shared device mode or shared iPad mode. And the pros and cons are all listed in the documentation, which is available with a click on this workshop. And just highly recommend you consider turning those things on today if you're not, or turning that functionality on today if you're not, and deploying in a shared device mode for frontline worker scenarios. All right, Steve, I think that is at a high level. I think I've gone through and touched the main talking points that I like to walk through when I'm walking through this with a customer. I hope this has been helpful to both you, and to the customers watching. And, if there's anything that I can do, feel free to reach out to me. Steve can put my information, my LinkedIn information in chat. I love talking to customers, and I'm happy to have conversations around device management, and specifically around the device management workshop. If there's something that's working well for you or not working well for you, I want to know about it. I will tell you that we've had overwhelmingly positive responses from both customers and partners who have run this workshop, and we're constantly improving it. You're going to see we're actually going through a refresh right now on the devices section and the identity section, where we're going through and refreshing a lot of our docs and our content. So, just want to make sure that you have the information that you need. So feel free to reach out.
Clay, thank you so much for coming on the show, running through the workshop. Again, I know that, typically these engagements are a lot longer, with customers diving deep into this. I hope that our audience received the fact that, this workshop is in depth. It is robust. Like, it will cover every nook and cranny of your organization. Especially today, we were just talking about devices. To Clay's point, this workshop covers the gamut. So Clay, thank you so much again for coming on the show. I don't know if you'll regret me putting your contact information in the
Never,
show notes,
Steve.
but
For you, I'll do anything. Just I totally give you permission.
I appreciate that, Clay, and thank you to our listeners, watchers, wherever you're watching this episode or listening to this episode today. Thank you for tuning in. We'll link all of the resources that Clay was talking about, as he covered the workshop today, in the notes for the show. And we hope you tune in next time for another episode of the Zero Trust Journey. Take care.
Thanks, Steve.